So this is the topic of today. I choose public archaeology in Romania because last week we were talking about the beginnings of museology and how archaeological heritage in Transylvania was somehow presented for the greater public, and how museology as also a tool of communication with the greater public begins in the 19th century. And in this lecture, I will come to the present, to the 20th century, 21st century, and how public archaeology arrives in Romania, when this happened, and what are the perspectives for this phenomenon. So I sometimes I hear some voices, but it's probably from the microphone of other colleagues. So maybe the best solution would be if the other colleagues close the microphones.
Yeah, we will ask no doubt. Ask the
okay, I think it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So public archaeology in Romania. But first, I would I would speak shortly what we call public archaeology. Public archaeology, of course, arrives in the post-war era in Europe and the United States. So we are talking about the second half of the 20th century. After the Second World War, in Europe especially, of course, the urban landscape was heavily affected by the war. Many of the buildings were destroyed in Germany, also in the UK, in Central East Europe, so basically everywhere in Europe. It was a big problem to reorganize the urban landscape. And this provoked, of course, major urban investments, major urban changes, and what we call today as urban archaeology, the excavation of the cities and the history of the cities, excavating in urban environments, arrives, or at least became more popular after the Second World War. One famous case study is from London, from the 1950s, when they discovered in London the Walbrook Mitreum, a Roman sanctuary dedicated to Mithras, the famous Mitreum dedicated to Mithras in the today the Bloomberg area, in the very heart of the financial center of London. And the discovery of this sanctuary, which was the very first Roman temple ever discovered in London, became basically a touristic attraction. You can see in these photos the queue of the Londoners were staying to watch this excavation site. It was a real public event for many days, for many weeks. Archaeologists were basically excavating in front of the great public. So it was a public event. It was highly popularized by the local press, and the Londoners, the local people, realized for the very first time that under their modern city there are many ancient or medieval layers. So it was the very first moment, awakened moment of the city, when they realized that archaeology is real in London, and archaeology can be also very attractive. This moment, the excavation of the Walbrook Mitreum and how they presented for the greater public, was the very first moment of what we call today as public archaeology, speaking, communicating with the greater public through the archaeological material. Today, of course, if you visit London, in the Walbrook site, the Bloomberg building, it's a modern financial building, of course, the famous Bloomberg company. They invested millions of euros in this building. It's one of the most interactive archaeological sites. It presents the sanctuary of Mithras, as you can see, in situ. They moved the building in another place, and now you can see it reconstructed in a modern building with holograms, voice effects. So basically, all of the sensual effects are touched by this building. It's really very beautifully presented archaeological site. And also the archaeological material they discovered. You can visit there, and there are many different ways of museal pedagogy. It's one of the most innovative museums I ever visited. I really recommend to see. Somehow it's a prototype of public archaeology or modern museology in urban context. So this was the beginning in the 1950s in London, and of course, later in the 1970s in the United States, archaeology became an issue. Obviously, we know very well the problems of the social sciences, humanities. It's always a big problem for in conflict on the neoliberal market of science. Knowledge production, science production now is in a crisis since the 1970s at least, or even before. And this was true also for archaeology in the United States. The very existence of this discipline, archaeology, in the United States obviously has other dimensions than in Europe. It's a totally different system. But interestingly, public archaeology as a notion, as a methodological tool, appears in the United States. The first book was published in 1972 by Charles McGimsey. Public Archaeology was the title of this book. And it was the first work, it was the first book which presented this problem that archaeologists before the Second World War were not really communicating with the authorities and with the greater public. It was the two big issues: communication, dialogue with the authorities and with the greater public. Because without a dialogue, without presenting our work to the greater public and the authorities, archaeology will have a very bad future. So Charles McGimsey was concerned about the existence and the very future, the fate of archaeology. And his solution was, the solution proposed by him was to communicate our results, to have a dialogue, an intense, a living relationship with the greater public. We need a respectful, conscious public and society who understand actually what we are doing. So that was the major issue, to destroy all the stereotypes regarding archaeology and to create a living academic dialogue with the greater public. The same phenomena we can see in the programmatic article of Hester Davis, Crisis in American Archaeology. Is the same issues we find in his article regarding the future of archaeology, the financial issues they have, the legal issues, the legal protection of archaeological work in the United States, and so on. So this was the first steps, which already changed also the legal aspect and the legal world of archaeology in the United States. Of course, there were some symbolic moments in the history of archaeology in the 20th century, especially after the UNESCO was founded. One of the most successful projects of the UNESCO was the translocation of the Abu Simbel temple in Egypt. Everybody knows these famous pictures, videos. There were many teams around the world participating in this massive project. And obviously it was sensational, visually it's very captivant, obviously. So therefore this project was the somehow the starting point of the UNESCO movement, and to create a consciousness of world heritage, that we have the materiality of the past. The past is ours, is a common heritage. It's not only Egyptian heritage, it's not only American heritage, Slovenian, Hungarian heritage, it's world heritage. it's part of the Homo sapiens as a species. What created in the past, it's a common heritage. So it was a very important moment, and of course all the legal changes in the 1960s and 70s, like the UNESCO Carta and also the Venezia Carta in 1964. These were important steps in changing the legal frame of archaeology. Today, public archaeology in the UK and in the United States has now a 50 years long history. So there is it's already a sub-discipline in archaeology. There are journals, special journals are focusing on public archaeology. There is even a journal, Public Archaeology. There are many important books on this. And there are many museums or institutions who are now leading this field. For example, the Museum of London Archaeology, the MOLA, of course, is one of the, let's say, leading institutions of this movement. And the UCL in London, University College London, also take a very important part of this new discipline. Gabriel Moschenska, you can see here, is also a very important figure of public archaeology. His book, Key Concept in Public Archaeology, is again, it's a very good manual. It's a guide for every archaeologist, museologist, and the greater public, of course. It's free. You can download. You can find on internet. It's free for everyone, and it's a very good introduction to what we call as public archaeology today. So in the West, in the UK, United States, also in Germany now, public archaeology is a reality for at least 40, 50 years. Well, obviously in Romania, things are a bit different. You can see here also this typology of actions. How can we communicate with the greater public? By Gabriel Moschenska, there are many ways and many methods to communicate the archaeological results and to create a consciousness of archaeological heritage. And I will present each of these categories for Romania in the following. So you will see these categories of Moschenska in Romania. How can we manifest, or how can we communicate the materiality of the past? So coming to Romania now, very shortly, at the moment, at this moment, Romania has officially 18,000 archaeological sites. That is, you can find in a national database of archaeological sites in Romania, which is ran.cimec.ro, or it's also, this map is coming from the map.cimec.ro. It's a national database which was, of course, has many negative aspects too, but at least we have something like that. So you can see that most of the archaeological sites are in green, but it depends on which region. At least in Transylvania, most of them are green, which means that they were attested archaeologically and the systematic excavations. The red points are rescue excavations. So from 18,000 archaeological sites in Romania, in the 1970s, in the communist period, Romania, of course, signed all the international treaties, the UNESCO Treaty, the Venezia Treaty. But after 1990, for more than 10 years, from 1990 to 2001, Romania didn't have an archaeological legislation. So there were no legal protection of this archaeological heritage. And that was a big problem because most of the archaeological sites were heavily looted. There were metal detectorists working everywhere, destroying the archaeological sites. The most famous case was, of course, the gold bracelets of the Dacian bracelets, 24 gold objects, beautifully elaborated golden jewelry found in the Dacian capital in the mountains in the 1990s. They were, of course, sold for the black market in Switzerland, later to New York. So it was one of the big tragedies of the 1990s after the communist regime, after the fall of the communist regime, that Romania didn't have for more than 10 years a legal protection of the archaeological sites. It was this period of administrative and legal chaos what was in in Romania in the 1990s. So it was one of the big issues. The changes occurs in the when this heavy looting of the golden bracelets were found out. So they realized that a massive amount of archaeological material was looted, was stolen from the country. So they need to change the legislation rapidly. And of course, it was one of the criteria of the European Union's adheration to the European Union. So this international pressure basically helped the Romanian legislation after 2000. And therefore, they introduced some of the archaeological sites in the UNESCO list. Romania has now 6 UNESCO heritage sites. Most of them are also archaeological sites. Of course, they can be historical and archaeological together. There are many categories there. It's not overlapping. I mean, they are overlapping sometimes. From these 6 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, the most famous ones, of course, are the Dacian fortresses from the late Iron Age period. You can see here already from last week, we were speaking about this late Iron Age sanctuary from Szabó to Zaregia. There are at least 4 others are in the World Heritage Sites. So there's not only one, but there are many in the same area with the Harceg Mountains. There was also the Saxon fortified villages. A part is Transylvania has more than 250 fortified medieval villages. Only 7 of them, unfortunately, are introduced in the UNESCO heritage sites. And Sighișoara, Scheisburg, again, it's a Saxon, beautiful Saxon city, perfectly preserved from medieval times in a historical center, is part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. So this happens in the 1990s, end of the 1990s, when these medieval and late Iron Age archaeological sites were introduced in the UNESCO list. They at least they have now a legal protection. But unfortunately, not all of these sites had archaeological investigation. You can, if you go on the UNESCO, if you go in the UNESCO page, you can see that on the web page, many of these sites have a very bad nomination dossier. Their papers and their nomination is extremely heterogeneous. So they didn't present the archaeological excavations. There were few archaeological excavations in these sites. In the 1990s, basically they nominated these sites as in a hurry. So it was just made to protect the sites. There were very few archaeological investigations. So one of the problems of these UNESCO sites is that we don't have modern contemporary excavations. We don't have a detailed archaeological monography on these sites. And after it was nominated and they are protected by international law, you can see also here that some of the sites are still covered by flora and by the nature. It's hard to accessible for tourism, so it's not really presented. They're not really tourism for long-term cultural heritage. And it's from how to present these sites and also to protect. Here, Romania have not only, but most of the countries have big issues to resolve this issue, the problem of sustainability and presenting the archaeological sites. A problematic case is Roșia Montana, the Roman mines. The Roman mines from Roșia Montana, the ancient Alburnus Major. It's the only subterranean gold mines of the Roman Empire, which more than 17 kilometers of galleries underground. It was well in the 18th century when the Habsburg Empire rediscovered these mines, and they used as modern mines too. Unique. We have, of course, Roman mines in Hispania, Las Medulas. We have Roman mines in Serbia, in Murcia Superior, but these are the only extensive subterranean Roman mines. So these are the Spanish gold mines, for example, are above the ground. So they are terrestrial mining, but underground mining was rare and of course extremely dangerous in Roman times too. So these gold mines are exceptional World Heritage. It was nominated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but unfortunately, because of course they still have a massive amount of gold there, around 170 tons of gold. It is a lot of money there. So unfortunately, in the 1990s, this was bought by a Canadian international company, the Roșia Montana Gold Corporation. They tried to they financed the archaeological excavations. They financed also the restoration of some of the buildings from Roșia Montana, this beautiful medieval and Habsburgic town. But the condition was that after the rescue excavation, the whole mountain will be exploded. It will be destroyed. This was the moment in 2012 and 2013 when the social civic movement began to save Roșia Montana. There were almost every week massive protests in every city in Romania, in Bucharest, Cluj, the major university cities, especially students were marching to save Roșia Montana. It was the first time in the history of Romania when an archaeological site and the natural landscape became a part of a civic movement. So protecting this extremely important archaeological site was an interesting. It became a political issue. Of course, it was heavily discussed in politics. The governments were discussing. Governments, for sometimes one of the governments even fall. So the government was collapsed after one of these protests. For the protests which began in 2013. They realized in 2018, no 16. Sorry, in 2016 they finished a nominalization dossier. They sent it to the UNESCO, but unfortunately, in 2018, the Romanian government decided to retrieve the dossier. Political networking. So that was still just on the nomination list. It's not yet UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's still heavily discussed and a problematic case study. But it was the first time when archaeology became a public issue and the public entered in the public consciousness. Romania has also so-called national archaeological sites, which has a national importance, mostly Greek and Roman cities from Transylvania, from Dobruja in the bank of the Black Sea. There are Greek cities, Histria, Tomis, Kalatis, Greek colonies founded in the 7th, 6th century BC. There are also some prehistoric sites from the Vinca culture, 5,000, 6,000 years old archaeological sites, and also the famous Kukuteny prehistoric Neolithic site. So these are the national archaeological sites, most of them restored in situ in the 1960s, 70s, some of them in the 1990s with very bad and heavy modification of the archaeological heritage. You can see here in Alba Iulia, for example, the Roman fort, the wall of the Roman fort are perfectly preserved, but in the 1990s, early 2000, they introduced this terrible opus quadratum imitation, which affects now, heavily affecting the original structures. So from the categories of Moschenska, what we have? Well, first of all, Moschenska is speaking about the so-called public archaeology in academic world. So how archaeologists realize, first of all, the importance of the dialogue. But there are very few articles. There are really just 2 or 3 studies in Romania which are focusing now on public archaeology as a theoretical model. So we still need to discuss this among us, archaeologists, museologists, historians. What is public archaeology? What are the major problems in Romania about archaeology? So it's still an open and very new field. So after 2014, after the 2013, after the Roșia Montana movement, we have this topic in our field. Sorin Nemeti and others he published a Masocal Manifesto for the Romanian public archaeology. It sounds extremely programmatic, but the article itself is not so programmatic as it sounds. But indeed, it was an important starting point in 2017 when he published this study. There are many other books about the protection of archaeological heritage, the archaeological heritage management, the history of archaeology. So there are many books in Romania now focusing on this dialogue and the future of archaeology. What will be the future of Romanian archaeology, and how can we present the archaeological heritage for the greater public? Yeah, there are many projects also, some of them of course already finished, but some projects are focusing on this idea of archaeological heritage for the greater public. Another issue is what Moschenska called as community archaeology. Community archaeology means when an archaeologist, a specialist, are living together, working together, forms a community with the greater public. So it's a working together with a greater public, and that of course means archaeological schools, open schools for the greater public. So you are excavating, you are opening an archaeological site just as a summer school or just to present your work for the greater public. It was very popular in the communist period, in the 70s, 80s. They had a lot of archaeological schools for students, for pupils, and high schools even. And nowadays, it's a renaissance of this movement. They re-begin to open up some archaeological sites to present for the students mostly, but also for pupils or other lay people who are not in the field. There were a project in Bonsida in a late 18th century palace. It's a classicist Baroque palace, and they opened up as you can see, a very small trench just to present for the students and for the tourists how an archaeologist works, and they, after a short 1-week training, they were able to work obviously in the supervision of many archaeologists. They have also a lot of festivals when archaeologists are presenting the material heritage. You can see archaeologists and museologists in Roman or medieval costumes, vestimentation, cooking Roman food, writing Roman wax tablets, basically what we call as experimental archaeology, but together with the greater public. So lay people, visitors, tourists can visit these festivals, and they are cooking together Roman foods. They are reconstructing Roman tents. They can use a Roman helmet and so on. So these events, what we call as community archaeology, when you can touch the objects, when you can see how a Roman or other types of objects are made, so you can see the whole process of the object together. That has a very long-term effect and a very positive effect on the greater public. Not only for children, obviously for children, this is the most successful projects, but also for the others, for older people. Community archaeology is one of the most successful way to create a dialogue. Another type of action in the typology of Moschenska is archaeology by the public. This is a very risky way. In Romania, it's very popular. What we are talking about here is the so-called reenactment groups. Reenactment, of course, they to present a historical period, usually Roman period in Romania. Is very popular to have a lot of Roman legionary military groups, but also some Dacian groups, for example, from late Iron Age Dacian kingdom and Dacian soldiers. Both of these stories are built up in the national ethnogenesis myth. So they are very popular for the greater public. The problem is with this method, presenting archaeology to the public, special. So archaeologists are not participating in this. These reenactment groups sometimes are not well prepared. They are presenting false objects. They are presenting partially true information. So it is problematic to have a control. There is no academic control of these events. But obviously they have a big success for the greater public. As you can see, these gladiator fights obviously are very, very attractive for the students, for the children, for everybody. But it's risky because these reenactment groups are not controlled. They don't have a specialist in the background. So, and obviously it depends on the formation of these groups. Sometimes they are really very well prepared. They know the bibliography. They are extremely read people. So they read, they know the archaeological material. But there are some cases when it's not really authentic. Another type mode or way to present archaeological heritage, of course, is in the typology of Moschenska, is the so-called public sector archaeology. So that means national projects, large projects, or multi-annual projects, when the state or the local authorities are financing archaeological projects. The biggest and the only one in Romania now is the Limes project. Romania is now preparing, together with Bulgaria and Serbia, the nominalization of the Limes, the Roman frontiers and its archaeological sites. It's a 5 years long international collaboration, partially with European money, partially with local money. So the national government, Romania, also gave a lot of money for this project. And it's a very successful project because the team, you can see here, they are the leaders of this project, the Romanian part. So the archaeologists are, they have also a lot of actions for the greater public. They organize beautiful expositions, for example. They have a new journal, Romanian Limes journal, which is mostly for the greater public. So it's beautiful pictures, beautiful 3D models of Roman forts and fortresses, and it's really visually very active and kept very attractive for the greater public. So these projects financed by the government should be, of course, a very good solution for archaeological heritage, public archaeology, but it's extremely rare to find. So this was basically the first international project financed by Romanian government in the last 20 years. But that's not a good statistics. Another way or methodology to present is, of course, archaeological education or modern museology, museum pedagogy. Well, of course, as you can see in many museums in Europe and also in the United States, these technological methods, what we call as 3D models, visual tours in museums. So everything what means the IT sector entering museology, and the collaboration between IT sector and museology will have the future, and will change our perspective on museology. It's very popular now in Romania too. Some of the museums already have this method. You can have, I don't know what kind of glasses, and you can touch, and you can move, and you can walk in ancient spaces. Some of the archaeological finds, the original archaeological finds, are digitized, like photo 3D objects. Basically, the same objects is digitized virtually, and you can just play with the archaeological objects. It's very popular now. It's a booming field, of course, in Romania too. We can discuss, of course, the limits of this methodology, but now it seems to be a trend in Romania. Shortly about the museums in Romania, there are 800 museums in Romania. 600 of these museums have a certain amount of archaeological material. So a big part of museums in Romania are actually archaeological museums or historical archaeological. Of course, sometimes it's mixed. Most of the national museums are also archaeological museums. There are two categories of museums: local museums controlled and financed by the local county government, not government, like the county budget, and the national museums, which are financed directly from the Ministry of Culture. The problem with the national museums in the last 30 years, especially after the fall of the communism, that they are closed, they are under restoration, they are under renovation. It's an administrative political issue here. It's a massive problem of the Ministry of Culture, which in the last 30 years, Romania have almost 40 ministries of culture. So some of them were staying for like 5 months. And that's impossible to have long-term projects. It's impossible to have continuity in museum pedagogy, in museology. And that is the biggest problems now in the Romanian museology, is the continuity and long-term projects. That's, for example, if you compare the history of the national museums in Serbia, in Bulgaria, in Hungary, for example, the National Museum in Budapest, in Belgrade, in Sofia, and compared to National Museum in Bucharest. The National Museum in Bucharest is a hybrid museum. It doesn't exist before, of course, 1918. I mean, Romania itself is formed after the First World War in the contemporary limits of today. And the museum was trying to collect its material, because obviously they tried to collect archaeological material from every part of the recently formed Romania. So they took the archaeological material from Transylvania, from Dobruja, from Iași, from Moldova. They collected the archaeological material in one place. And in the 1990s, this museum was collapsed. Basically, the museum now is not functioning. It has really big problems, big issues to redefine itself, to find a way how to present this very mixed history with four historical regions with totally different historical background, how to present this extremely heterogeneous history in one national museum. They didn't find a way yet, and it's a big problem. There are also many IT companies collaborating with Romanian archaeologists now. They reconstructed the Dacian capital of Sarmisegetuza Regia in a 3D model, but it's still not enough for tourism. For example, we need more applications, phone applications, for example. We need more practical methods to present this archaeological heritage for the greater public. The most successful exposition, archaeological pedagogical exposition, was in 2014 and 2018. It's almost 3 or 4 years. It was an itinerary exposition. They visited almost every big city in Romania. They presented the gold and silver treasures of Romania. So basically every big treasure, big hoard discovered from the Bronze Age till the early Middle Ages. Millions of euro. Of course, the value is it's unestimable. It's how you say this, assurance. The assurance of the exposition was 400 million euro, but it's just a symbolic number. It was the first time when all of the treasures were presented for the greater public in a very, very beautiful way. They made really interactive posters, videos, new ways of exposition. So it was really a groundbreaking moment in Romanian museology, because before that, every museal exposition looked like in the 1970s. So it was extremely overdated, and it was extremely outdated way of museological expositions. This was the first moment when they tried to present this material in a very European, modern aspect. So that was an important moment. But of course, it was just one project. They need now, again, to continue somehow with similar projects. And obviously, it was an extremely popular exposition with hundreds of thousands of visitors. So it was a sensation that, and it obviously proved that archaeology is cool. Archaeology is attractive. Archaeology is interesting for the 21st century. I mean, it was the most obvious way to show for the politicians, for our local authorities, that if you have a beautiful exposition, if you have, of course, fascinating archaeological materials, if you present the story of an object, then you will have a big success. And that was, I think, it was one of the positive parts of this project, that it showed for the greater public, for the critics, for the investors, for the politicians, that you can make money also with archaeology. There are many public presentations nowadays in pubs, in restaurants, in student places, in universities, of course before COVID, obviously, but it was a big success to present, especially in urban archaeological projects, urban excavations, to present for the greater public. This is, for example, a case study from Cluj in 2017, when they found, I mean, it has a very interesting story, but I don't have time now to explain. They found a medieval necropolis, medieval cemetery, and some medieval structures. So they presented for the local people, because the local people obviously had some strange ideas about robbing the tombs, destroying the city, and so on. So the archaeologists presented the archaeological material, what they found, and it was a big success. It was a good example how you can communicate archaeological results together with the press. The press was very communicative, very collaborative. The local newspapers, the local televisions, they were very collaborative, and it was the first moment when an urban archaeological excavation was in the news. It was everywhere. So it was a great propaganda, if you want, for the archaeology, and I think it's a good way to do in the future. There are also what Moschenska called open archaeology, presenting archaeological sites for the greater public. But in this case, in contrast with the community archaeology, in this case, on open archaeology, the public is a passive presence. So they are not excavating, they are not participating in excavation, but they just watching the works of archaeology. Basically, this is how it begins in London in the Walbrook site. So it was open archaeology, working in front of a public. And they organize many open days, of course, in different archaeological sites. In Cluj in 2017, the same excavation I was talking about before, they had even guides, tourist guides for the archaeological tours in 3 languages, in Hungarian, Romanian, and in English. So it was something very new, something very unusual in that period. And of course, we have the so-called popular archaeology, popularizing archaeology by books, by films, by journals, by Facebook pages, by blogs, by podcasts, and 1,000 other ways. There are many Facebook pages now. In Romanian archaeological sites have their own Facebook page. They publish a lot of archaeological books and popularizing material. So it's a booming field. But I said, in the UK, it has at least 50 years long history. In Romania, it has just, let's say, 5-10 years in the best case. And in conclusion, so basically, there's the public archaeology was a necessity. It was necessary to have a dialogue with the greater public, especially in the post-war era. And it, of course, in the West, it has now a long history, 50 years long history. Here in Romania, we have, and only in the last 7-8 years after the Roșia Montana movement. But it's a booming field. I'm positive, I'm optimistic in this way, that hopefully in the future we will have even more engagement from the politics from the investors, from the private sector. The private sector need also to collaborate with archaeologists. And this is the only way in the future for archaeology, I think, if we unite public sector, political sector, and the academic sector.